Well, hello there, woman beings, and welcome to another episode of the Woman Being Podcast. We are so excited to be here with you today. As always, I have Miss Emma, I have Miss Kelly.
Good morning.
I am Kelly Ann, and we are here with Miss Meghan Tschanz. Welcome back, Meghan. We are so excited to have you. It is exciting, and we have for the first time Allyson. Allyson, welcome. We are so happy you're here. Today, guys, we are going to be talking about the ERA. And if you don't know what the ERA is, don't worry. We're going to break it all down for you and give you some amazing action steps on how you can participate. So without further ado, we are going to just dive right in. This is Woman Being,
where we explore thoughts and opinions
and have the freedom to change our minds
without expectation or judgment.
We will hold a safe space and support each other
as we navigate together in the form of feminine.
All right. Welcome, woman beings. We are so excited to be talking about the ERA today with two experts.
Which is the Equal Rights Amendment.
Which, by the way, if you don't know, is the Equal Rights Amendment. I have been talking about this to people, and they are asking pretty consistently, what is the ERA? Don't worry, we're going to be answering all the questions. So we have Miss Meghan Tschanz here today, who is the host of the Faith and Feminism podcast, which I define as the OG of feminist Christian podcasts. So welcome, Meghan. She is also the author of Woman Rising, and she is partnering with Justice Revival. So hello, Meghan. We are so happy to have you here again with us today.
I am so excited to be here. And I do want to clarify, I would not consider myself an expert on the ERA. That is definitely Allyson. She is a human rights lawyer. You're going to hear more about her. I consider myself passionate about the ERA and an advocate to get it passed. So
I love it. Yes.
I am very knowledgeable, but I would not consider myself an expert.
No, that's great. Thank you so much for the clarification. We have, amongst ourselves, described you as the fire that just like pushes shit through barriers. So we're so glad to have you here. And we also have Miss Allyson McKinney-Timm. Welcome. She is the founder and executive director of Justice Revival. She is a human rights lawyer, and she is also a ruling elder in the Presbyterian Church USA. Welcome, Miss Allyson. We are so glad to have you here.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
We're just going to dive right into the nitty-gritty. Allyson, can you tell us what the ERA is and why it's so important? Like, what's the deal?
So the ERA is a very basic human rights reform. It is a constitutional amendment or an addition, a very short addition, I think about 24 words, that would be added to the Constitution to ensure that women and that all American citizens enjoy equal citizenship stature in our Constitution. It is a reform that has been many years in the making. Advocates have fought for women to be fully included and to be treated equally before our government since at least the end of the Civil War. The current ERA was adopted by Congress nearly 50 years ago. And so it represents a long struggle and some very dear hopes and aspirations, I should say, of over half of the American nation to be really respected and treated as equal citizens under the law.
I love it. Which sounds like all good things, right? Which makes it a little weird that this has taken so long. So can you outline some of the progress that has been made and then the why this progress has really been delayed?
Yeah, there's been enormous progress in the last 50 years, especially. So the ERA that we're talking about right now was passed by a bipartisan supermajority of Congress in 1972, nearly 50 years ago. It will be 50 years next month in March.
Wow.
Yes. And there was, at the time, very strong bipartisan support. It was part of both major political parties' platforms at the time. Senator Richard Nixon supported the ERA, and so it had broad support. And then the second requirement under Article 5 of the Constitution is that 3/4 of states need to ratify the ERA. And we have now met that threshold. So there's a lot of history there. But to fast forward, in 2020, Virginia became the 38th state or last needed state to ratify the ERA, and a great victory led by Jennifer Carroll Foy there, among other Virginia state legislators. And so because of that, 2 years on from that final ratification, takes us to January 27th of 2022, just a few weeks ago. That's the day we believe the ERA actually did go into effect based on the process set out under Article 5, because all of those constitutional requirements have been met. There are still some barriers, though. The ERA is still deeply contested socially and politically. And there are some struggles that we can talk about. Actually, in every branch of government, there's something going on that is presenting a barrier to the ERA being fully embraced and fully recognized. To sum up why this has taken so long, that's also a complex story, and there's a lot of aspects to this. But at the root of it all it truly is the question of equality, the question of sex equality. Are we willing to say that because women are equal in dignity and worth as human beings, that they should be treated equally before our government? That is what is at issue here. And I believe deeply that's always been what the debate is about. And that's still what it's about today.
Wow. You are so well-spoken and can really just pinpoint so well, because as someone who is educating themselves really for the first time about the complexities of this issue, that was just like a breath of fresh air. I feel like I've been just frantically flitting from one article to another and a podcast and maybe a show or a documentary or something. And so thank you so much for being able to summarize that all so well and so clearly.
Well, it's my pleasure. And, there is a lot out there. There's a lot to parse through. So it's just know that that's not unexpected. That's not uncommon. It takes a minute to get your arms around this issue.
For sure. So then, Meghan, why do you think there's still so much resistance to adding this as a constitutional amendment? To me, it feels very simple. Like Allyson said, it's 24 words, and it's really straightforward. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, I want to reiterate that it's very, very simple. In fact, I've memorized the Equal Rights Amendment.
Yeah.
It says very simply, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That's it. That's really, that's what we're asking for, is that our rights aren't denied or abridged by the United States or any state. And so you think that would be really, really basic. But what we find is I think there's a lot of different resistance, and that's for different reasons. One reason, I think a lot of people don't know about the Equal Rights Amendment, right? You guys just learned about it. I just learned about it. Yeah. Well, I guess several years ago, I was at a conference where I heard Ally give a presentation on it. And it startled me. It blew my mind. I've had her on my podcast talking about the Equal Rights Amendment for 3 years. And in the beginning, you could tell I really didn't have a full understanding. Now that I've been partnering with Equal Justice Revival to pass the ERA, I've learned a lot more about it. So I think one of the major problems we have, and one of the biggest resistances we have, is people don't know about it. In fact, 80% of U.S. citizens think we already have something like the Equal Rights Amendment in our Constitution. Mm-hmm. And this is something that it's really, really basic. 85% of all countries have this protection, have something in their constitution that fully protects women. And we don't have that. So we are also in the minority of countries in the world that doesn't have something that protects us. And so I think there's a lack of knowledge, number one. Number two, people think that we already have it. And then number three, I think there's a lot of misinformation about what it is. And I know that when I talked to you all about the Equal Rights Amendment, we had, our little phone call before, and you went and talked to your family members about it, you heard, well, if this happens, then that will happen. And they had a lot of connotations about what the Equal Rights Amendment was, what it would mean, what it would bring. And so there's a lot of misinformation about, a lot of people, specifically in conservative Christian circles, will say, this is actually a stealth missile, using their own words, or a Trojan horse for abortion rights. And so we'll get into that deeper, but that's not true. And of course, we'll get into that deeper because, like I said, this is complicated. And this is why we have Allyson here, because she is a human rights lawyer. She is an expert, if there's ever been an expert, on the Equal Rights Amendment. And other just things that are not true, misinformation. And we have, Allyson and I have been doing a circuit, so to speak, on different podcasts, educating on the Equal Rights Amendment. And we come into contact with a lot of these misinformations. Mainly, I think maybe one of the primary ones is that women and men already have equal rights. It's not needed. And of course, it is, and we'll get into that.
Yeah,
but I also think it's really important to notice the history of the Equal Rights Amendment. Like Allyson said, this has been going on for well over a century. In 1923 was the first time Alice Paul introduced the first draft of the Equal Rights Amendment. We saw it almost pass in the 1970s, and Allyson said it had bipartisan support, Republicans and Democrats, for this amendment. Where it really hit a wall and where it really hit a snag is specifically from the conservative religious right. Probably not surprising, thinking of the world that we live in today. But there was a woman, her name is Phyllis Schlafly, who kind of made it her mission to make it so that the Equal Rights Amendment wouldn't pass. One of her main arguments is that women kind of belonged in the home, and the Equal Rights Amendment would not give women protection in the home, which of course is another form of misinformation. And it's really interesting if you look at Phyllis Schlafly's life, because she kind of painted herself as this like good Christian submissive housewife, but she was actually, a very involved in, she ran for Congress. She didn't succeed, but she really did have this very thriving professional life. And a lot of her work, like I said, was trying to prevent the Equal Rights Amendment from passing. And so in some ways, in a lot of ways, she did succeed because there was a time limit in the 1970s that was given with the Equal Rights Amendment. And initially, the Equal Rights Amendment had a lot of momentum. I think in the first year, you'd have to double check, but I'm pretty sure in the first year, 30 of the 38 states required passed it in the first year. But that's when it really started to slow down afterwards with campaigning, in part from Phyllis Schlafly, also corporate interests, and it didn't pass. And so from then to now, we see primarily the most outspoken opponents of the Equal Rights Amendment is from the religious right. And so that's kind of where we are today. We're still kind of fighting that battle from the religious right because there's a lot of misinformation about exactly what the Equal Rights Amendment will do.
Just to tack on or to pick up on a point that Meghan made, the funny thing is the issue is simple, and yet it's been made complicated, right? Mm-hmm. So like Meghan was pointing out, the vast majority of countries in the world, every constitution adopted since World War II has a basic provision to protect against rights violations based on sex. So in that way, we're not talking about anything radical. It's very elementary when we speak of all human beings having equal human rights. But it has been made complex because of the nature of misinformation, the types of claims that have been made about the ERA, and the political and social anxieties that it touches on. So Meghan mentioned Phyllis Schlafly, and Meghan actually turned me on to this phenomenal book, Jesus and John Wayne, which I imagine you all know, by Kristen Corbez-Dumay.
Yeah.
And her chapter 3 on this is just really striking. I was looking at it again recently and was really struck by how Schlafly's activism tapped into the anxieties of white American Christians. And when she was talking about women wanting to be at home, she was definitely talking about white middle-class women who had that luxury of choice to be a full-time homemaker. And the resistance to the ERA was the cause that religious conservatives picked up once their fight against racial integration had been lost. And so it's just absolutely striking what a direct line there is between resistance to the civil rights movement, to racial equality, and then to sex equality.
Mm-hmm. That is such a good point. And I'm so glad you brought that up, Allyson. There's a fantastic quote by an activist, an Indigenous activist named Lilla Watson. And I think of it often. And it says, if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come to help me because our liberation is bound together, then let us work together. Mm-hmm. And I think if anything has taught me about this move for justice, for the equal rights movement, for women's rights, it's deeply tied also to racism and to white supremacy and to homophobia. These things all, these fears kind of compound on one another. And it's really important to remember that when women, primarily, so if we're talking about the equal rights movement, all women are affected, all women are left vulnerable, but particularly women of color, women who identify as queer are particularly vulnerable. And we can see this in the stats. For example, if we're talking about pay discrimination here in the United States, for women, white women and men are I think it's all women and white men. It's 84 cents to the dollar. But if you go down to the other races, it increases further. And for Latina women, they only get paid 54 cents to the dollar as white men. And we see this also with maternal mortality. In the United States, we have a really, really, really high maternal mortality. It's terrible, but that rate increases 3 to 4 times for Black women. And so when we talk about these issues of justice, specifically the equal rights movement, yes, we need it for all women. But if you think about the other factors of injustice that are play, the most vulnerable people are women of color and queer women.
Yeah, and you guys talking about Phyllis Schlafly actually makes me think of, have you guys seen the show on Hulu, Mrs. America?
I haven't watched it. I've definitely heard about it, but I heard about it in the context of sort of the critiques that from what I've heard, it is looking back, but it doesn't bring us up to date that this is still an ongoing movement. That's what I've heard secondhand. If you've seen it, I'd be really curious in what you thought.
Yeah, we all took a deep dive into ERA, everything, I think, after our first conversation with Meghan when she reached out to us about doing this podcast. And I listened to several podcasts, including yours, and Mrs. America was one of the things. And I think Phyllis Schlafly, the character, is played by Cate Blanchett, who is just incredible. And the series, I think, in a way really humanizes Phyllis, but also is very, very critical of her, in my opinion. And but I think it seems a little skewed against her, for sure, according to her family and other people that said. It's definitely
isolated into a historic piece, though, rather than being present
it's definitely
day.
Not
it's not like necessarily an activation to further the Equal Rights Amendment being passed today. They do, I think, at the very end of the series have a couple of text slides that say this is what's happening now with it. But the show is definitely set in that specific time when the ERA was first introduced and then trying to get passed up until the it goes up until what, the 80s, or I'm not sure. It doesn't get into present day for sure. But one thing that I thought of that you guys said about Phyllis Schlafly is that point that she actually had a thriving professional career. And there's this incredible moment in the show where some of the women that are part of the Stop ERA movement are speaking to some women that are part of the women's rights movement. And the woman who is for the ERA asks them, like, oh, like, did Phyllis Schlafly teach you how to lobby? Did she teach you how to, like, manage all the accounting for Stop ERA? Did she teach you this? And then they were like, yes, she taught us all of this. And she's like, congrats, you have a job. And their whole thing was that they wanted to remain housewives. And in trying to preserve their housewifedom, they all got jobs, which was to stop the ERA.
Yeah.
And that was fascinating to me.
But one of the things I found about the show that was really helpful is you mentioned like kind of this misinformation that has sort of affected the ERA's ability to move forward, which is very true. Like it's this idea that like, oh, the ERA is, it's a tool for the liberal agenda. It's like just a precursor to legalizing abortion, et cetera. But then you kind of get a chance in the show to see women who are genuinely concerned, and because they're unskilled and accustomed to this privileged life of being a mom and just taking care of kids and, doing their regular thing, the prospect of a husband being able to leave the home and them being left all on their own feels very real to them, which, of course, the Equal Rights Amendment is meant to protect women. And so we obviously like it's skewed in that way, but it was just very fascinating how this show portrays Phyllis as this basically very strong, independent, like intelligent woman who takes advantage of the fears of middle America and starts a movement to end progress. And it still blows my mind on to what end for her. Because she very, very clearly was a capable woman.
Yeah, well-educated.
Who could, she had access to things, but it does speak to this sort of ignorance among white middle America, especially in religious circles, to the reality that most women are facing. And I think we still see that manifested today in religious circles. I've noticed a lot of rhetoric about like fatherlessness and how it's the reason for all the problems in our country, and we need to bring the fathers back home, which I think this show helped me realize is actually just a religious response to women needing rights and like protections under the Constitution so that despite what men are doing, they can still survive and be happy and healthy and whole in this country. So it's really fascinating to me to see how like that sort of has been rebranded now in 2022 as like, oh, well, fatherlessness is our problem.
Yeah, the solution is to empower the men more.
Yes, exactly.
I've actually encountered that myth a lot. And I'm going to speak not specifically to the Equal Rights Amendment, but to feminism in general.
Yeah.
You hear this idea that feminism is anti-motherhood, which I think could not be further from the truth. I think feminism is anti-vulnerable motherhood. Right. And if you look at what many feminists are fighting for, and if we look at specifically the Equal Rights Amendment, this is only helping mothers be mothers. It's helping women who face pregnancy discrimination, which is still a major problem here in the United States. Like this, our society has not been built or values mothers. And we can see this also with our maternal mortality rate. And so we believe by fighting for rights of women, this is pro-motherhood. This is anti-vulnerable motherhood. And so I've encountered that a lot, and you'll hear that a lot today, that they're at odds with one another, but it's definitely not true.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say that vision that Schlafly painted was such an idealized vision of the home. at a time, I think, before domestic violence was even addressed under the law, much less talked about publicly. So there was a lot happening that wasn't being talked about. And Meghan, I'm glad you pivoted to how important the ERA is for mothers and for their children and for their families. Because absolutely, when we look at the major issues of justice that have not been remedied under our current legal framework, we're talking about a lot of issues that make it extremely difficult for mothers to hold it together. We're talking about lethal domestic violence that doubles in risk during the time when a woman is pregnant. We are talking about a persistent, glaring gender pay gap that makes it incredibly difficult for single mothers in particular to stay out of poverty or to get out of poverty. We're talking about that maternal mortality rate that is just egregious for a wealthy, technologically advanced nation like ours. So all of these problems that are really harms and risk factors for women, for mothers, and for their families, these are the very human costs of injustice that the ERA is necessary to address, because it goes to our very foundation of our legal system. And if we don't have the foundation right, it's hard to expect that the system that's built on top of it will be just and will be robust and reliable for women and for all people too, because protecting against sex equality, it actually goes both ways. And there are cases on the books right now that disadvantage fathers over mothers. For instance, there's a case that makes it harder for a dad to ensure that their child gets citizenship. It uses a different standard for fathers than mothers. And so a protection against sex discrimination is something that both in the case law that we've seen in the past and with the prospect of ERA ratification also would protect men against sex discrimination.
Yeah, I love pointing that out, that it benefits all. We've mentioned how the current protections that are in place for women are not sufficient. But I kind of want to dive into how exactly they might not be sufficient, because as I've been doing research about the ERA and stuff, I've been just like reading our different constitutional amendments, and the 14th Amendment is one that stood out to me because in Section 1 it says that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And in reading that as a, obviously not law-educated human, it sounds like that would protect everyone, right? So I'm curious to hear, why is it that maybe the 14th Amendment isn't sufficient? Or why is it that we need the Equal Rights Amendment if we already have an amendment like this?
So, good question. The 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause was not originally intended to include women. It was only much later interpreted gradually through litigation, case by case, to protect women to some degree. It still does not protect against sex discrimination with the same rigor that it protects against, for instance, racial and religious discrimination. And finally, the protection women do have under the 14th Amendment is contested. So conservative jurists like the late Justice Scalia don't believe the Equal Protection Clause should protect women against sex discrimination because that's not what was originally intended. So that was like the outline, and we could plumb any of those points further. But I mentioned before that after the Civil War, there were women's rights advocates who really hoped that when those 14th and 15th Amendments were adopted, protecting citizenship rights and voting rights, that women would be included along with formerly enslaved men, but women were not. And there's litigation where women sought to assert their rights and they lost. And of course, we know it wasn't until the early 20th century that women even gained the right to vote. And in the 1960s, it was still lawful under the Constitution to have a statute that said that women couldn't be part of a certain profession, couldn't necessarily serve on juries, would not be considered equally with a man to serve as an administrator of an estate. And that was perfectly legal. The first Supreme Court case was 1971, Reed versus Reed, that for the first time through a new, at that time, legal theory, ruled that the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause does extend to women to protect against discrimination on the basis of sex. And one other fun fact I'll throw out is that it was actually a Christian clergywoman, the Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray, who originated that theory. And that's why Justice Ginsburg gives her credit on her legal brief in that case. So Pauli Murray was the origin. And of course, Ginsburg and other advocates have taken this quite a long way. So there has been tremendous progress in the last 50 years, but it's just never gotten us to equality. It's never changed the reality of the extent of gender-based injustice that persists. It's not as reliable or durable as having an explicit statement in the Constitution that women are equal citizens. And hey, look, at the end of the day, if we agree on equality, it seems to me there's no good reason why we wouldn't just say that directly.
Yeah, that was one thing that has stuck out to me a lot in this exploration of the ERA history, which is this idea that we're like one of, if not the only developed nation without women protected in our Constitution, and that there are hundreds of countries ahead of us that protect women in the Constitution. And this idea that if America is truly so free and we truly do have all these, rights and freedoms, then surely women would be protected, right? But it's just shocking to me that that's actually not the case.
Right. And, ensuring that this is written in the Constitution isn't, of course, the end of the story. It's a vital, necessary step, but it's still kind of the beginning of the road toward justice. And then we have to live into that promise. We have to live up to it and actually reflect that in our statutes, in our regulations, in our practices. So sometimes people point to other countries that might have this in their constitution, but not be as equitable in the lived experience of women. And that's true. That's fair. And yet it is putting this in the Constitution is a really vital step in the process.
Yeah. I mean, I think about the thing is that it's one of the many steps within progress. Like you change the laws, but also need to change people's minds, need to change the way that people act, people's practices, and their just attitudes towards women or towards any group that's been marginalized. And I also, when we compare to other countries, one of the arguments I've heard a lot from people who are essentially defending the United States, which the United States is a wonderful place to live overall. But I hear the statement of, well, we're not as sexist as these other countries, or we're not as racist as these other countries. We're not and it's it doesn't matter. That's not the issue. The issue is that there is sexism in the United States. The issue is that there is racism in the United States. And sure, we may not have exactly the same kinds of oppression as some other countries have. It shouldn't matter whether or not we are doing maybe slightly better than some other countries. And I also think that idea that we're quote unquote better is flawed, because it's rooted in a lot of just inherent patriotism that we have, where we think, oh, well, the United States is the best place to be, period, because that's what we've been told our whole lives.
And yeah, actually that in a recent conversation with my parents, me and my sister were both pointing out issues in some of the United States laws and politics. And I remember very clearly my mom kind of stopped the conversation with, well, you have some of the most freedoms and most amazing rights in the Constitution, and so therefore remember to be thankful. And that was sort of like the end to the conversation, is like, well, you have it good here, so just stop complaining.
I want to point out, because I hear this a lot, I think we specifically hear this in the Christian community a lot. There's a lot of Christian nationalism. And what I want to point out to them is actually the United States is ranked 51st in gender parity, or gender equality is another word for it, by the World Economic Forum. 51st, and we're actually behind our neighbors, Canada, Mexico, and Cuba. There's many reasons that we're lagging behind, but one is our maternal mortality rate is, around the world, we see these rates going down. In the United States, the rates are going up, which is unacceptable.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then another reason is we have very little representation in government. So this was done in, I believe 2017. It was the World Economic Forum report. So since then we've seen more women join as representatives in the government or get elected into the government. But if we're looking at the makeup of our government, it's still very much male dominated, and specifically white male dominated. And so we really do have a lack of representation. And so the United States, we want to claim to be a leader in women's rights, but we're falling behind in many, many areas. And obviously the Equal Rights Amendment is one of them, but also maternal mortality, we don't have paid leave. There's so many different reasons. And so for me, when I hear that argument, I really want us to be real and sober about where we are as a nation. And this doesn't mean we don't love our nation, right? If we love our country, we want it to be the best it can be. And right now, it's not. It has a lot of work to do in many areas. And this is not a hatred for the country. This is a belief that we can be better and we can do better. And so whenever I get attacked by saying I'm anti-America because I talk about the ways that the United States fails women, I say, no, I love my country. I love my country so much that I'm willing to make her better, even if people disagree with me. And so I think we need to be sober about where we are as a nation when it comes to women's rights.
Yeah, that is sobering.
Beautiful, Megan, too, how you said, if we love our country, we want it to be the best we can be. And to me, that's a beautiful expression of the kind of gratitude that that maybe our parents are reminding us to have for our country. Yeah, we're grateful. We have these freedoms. We can speak out about these issues. We can organize. We can see the benefits that having rights protections have brought, and we can work to make them stronger for our country and, for the sake of other countries that may be paying attention, and that we are not able to urge to better their own protections for women if we're not already doing that same thing ourselves here at home.
Yeah, I love that. It's the idea that honesty doesn't remove gratitude. Gratitude and honesty about problems can actually live in the same space. I love that. I think that's such a good almost rebuttal to that, just be grateful. It's absolutely, I'm grateful, but also I want to advocate for myself. I want to advocate for others, and I want to advocate for future generations.
Well, and I don't want to be disillusioned to the idea that in the United States, as a woman, I am at the very tippity top of privilege as it could possibly be. Which, as a white woman, I do have a lot of privilege, and I totally recognize that. But we also have a lot of work to do, and I experience sexism all the time. So I do want to see us get better and grow, and become what we're meant to be. Along that same line, Allyson, like you had alluded to before, as we're talking about conversations with parents, maybe conversations with our conservative friends, our religious circles, one of the big questions that will come up is like, okay, yeah, that sounds fine, but like, what's the catch? You know, like what's the secret agenda? What's the Trojan horse, or what's in the Trojan horse, I suppose? Whose agenda is being pushed? So can you speak into that and sort of dispel some of those fears, I guess?
My answer to that would be the agenda of the widow and the orphan. I think that's whose agenda is at stake when we talk about the ERA. And for those of us who are fond of the Hebrew Bible, we know that's an agenda really close to God's heart. And I mean that in all sincerity. As a Christian human rights proponent, deeply interested in the theological foundations for our human rights from a Christian perspective, to me, this is just core to the ideal of justice that is so clearly commended to us in Scripture, from the days of the prophets to the teachings of Christ. And if we are serious about doing justice, and especially for the widow and orphan, which the Bible makes clear that is the mission, that is the calling, today, as in biblical times, it is women who are often disproportionately vulnerable, along with religious, ethnic minorities, immigrants, LGBT individuals. But women among those groups, especially vulnerable to injustice, and the very best tool we have, and a tool that actually has deep Christian roots, is the idea that all people have dignity and worth, and that means they have some basic human rights. They are entitled to be treated with decency. They are entitled to be included in our society to the extent that's needed for them to flourish and thrive. And so, to my mind, there is not a more righteous cause than this, than upholding human rights for all people, and to say this is an expression of the Christian faith. This is a way to live out the gospel. This is one of the most practical ways that you could show love for your neighbor. And so it kind of breaks my heart to think that there's a fear that there's a hidden agenda behind that. It almost, it almost brings tears to my eyes that there's such a fear of that, because it's so basic to the idea of justice, which is so core to the Christian witness, or should be. Sorry, I just preached a little sermon there.
No, that was
honestly,
good.
it was very moving.
Yeah.
I got emotional hearing you say that, and I think that that's key to remember is why would we be opposed to people having basic human rights? Like, why would that be a contentious issue? In fact, Christians, based off of the Bible, should be first in line to contend for others to have basic human rights, regardless of whether they agree with them politically or religiously or anything. Like, the key is, common decency for all people.
Yeah.
That's right. I mean, human rights are not a reward for good behavior. There's not a moral litmus test, because we would all fail. I mean, certainly from a Christian theological view, we're all fallible. We all fall short in our own ways. And yet all of us are glorious people made in the image of God and deserving of dignity and respect.
Yeah, I love what you said. Basic human rights are not a reward for good behavior. I have been having a lot of conversations recently around LGBTQ rights because a prominent Christian leader in our community recently came out, and it's forcing a lot of people to have a lot of really good, hard conversations and really look at their own beliefs. And Megan used this line in our chat a few weeks ago, and I've been bringing it up multiple times, and it's like, so you don't want gay people to have rights? Like that's so silly. Like, why why would that bother you? Like, it's really the opposite of the heart of God when you really get down to it. And it's this attitude that has really pushed my deconstruction journey of like, well, if this is the manifestation of what these people believe God is, or what, the preaching and teachings of Jesus was, like, I'm like, I don't know that I actually want to be a part of that, because I actually really care for people. And whether I agree with them or not is beside the point. Like, the point is you're human and you deserve to be treated like one, and you deserve every opportunity just as I do and just as every other person does. So I really love that.
I think we need to reframe what denying human rights means. Like, so you're saying, this is a way I like to reframe it. So you're saying because you don't want women to have equal rights, or say queer people to have equal rights, you're saying you think it's fair that they are subject to more violence. You think it's fair that they are paid less for the same amount of work. You think it's fair that they can be discriminated, and is that what you want? You want them to be discriminated in their work? I don't understand how anyone, regardless of someone's background or choices, or their sex or their gender or whatever it is, why would Christians ever want people to be in harm's way and defend that harm? It doesn't make sense to me.
Absolutely. I think it's really painful to look at the system that you have been so fond of for so long and that you have benefited from, and realizing like, oh, this actually is not a good thing. Like, maybe I got goodness from it, but that doesn't mean that it is inherently good and beneficial for others. I think collectively we all need to be brave and honest about those things. And that is part of what I personally feel like fuels justice. Being honest about things that maybe have benefited you, and be okay with giving up that benefit for the sake of your brother, your sister, and whoever it might be negatively affected by it. Anyways, but that is besides the point. Not entirely.
Well, I think it is the point.
It is the point. I just keep kind of getting on a tangent. But Megan, I would really be interested to hear from you. How does not being specifically included in our Constitution practically affect women on the day-to-day basis? You brought a lot of really good points to us a few weeks ago. And I mean, myself particularly, I was stunned by some of them. So would you be willing to share some of those things?
Yeah, I'll try and sum it up in different categories, because there are so many different ways that it affects us now. And should the Equal Rights Amendment be fully recognized, that things would change. So one way is culture. Obviously, having in our Constitution that women are deserving of rights would change our culture. And I think this would also change the way that, I mean, even in our Christian community, you'll see a lot of reverence for the Constitution. At least I know in my background Christian community, there was a lot of reverence for the Constitution. And so I think even in our Christian communities, if we see on paper women cannot be discriminated against, I think this will change culture, and that will really see women in a way that's deserving, in a way that's not second-class citizens. Because I think even in the church, we're all well aware that women are often, particularly in conservative evangelical contexts, treated as second class. They're not allowed to teach. They're not allowed to lead. They're not allowed to preach. They're told to submit to the men in our lives. And I really do think that this amendment could start to change culture. Another way that it would change is our laws. So as Allyson mentioned earlier, there are still laws in states that are extremely sexist. And so what that would require is, if the Equal Rights Amendment would pass, is for people to go through those laws and get rid of laws that don't fall in line with the Constitution. And in this case, discrimination against women. And so there's, I'm sure you hear all the time of these residual laws of that seem just outrageous that they're still there, but no one has taken the time to go through and remove them. And so that's another way it can help. And I think primarily what I want to focus on, because I think this is what's so shocking and why we've seen so little progress for women here in the United States, is in court cases. So Justice Revival, Allyson worked on this incredible policy brief. So I hope people go and look at this afterwards, because it's going to say everything a lot more in depth, and you can read up on it more. And I'm also going to be referencing a book called Equal Means Equal by Jessica Neuwirth. So I'm going to be talking about I'll talk about briefly about 3 different court cases that would be different if we had the Equal Rights Amendment. So one of them this is a story that Allyson and I tell often. It's near and dear to both of our hearts, is in Castle Rock, Colorado, actually the town I grew up in. I had a neighbor who had a violent husband, got a restraining order against her husband because he was violent. And on this restraining order, it said, that the police or whoever authorities were required to protect her. Should it come to it, her husband abducted 3 of their 3 daughters. And she called the police and said, hey, my violent husband, who I have a restraining order against, abducted my children, and I'd like them back. I'd like you to protect them. And she kept on contacting police, and I kept on putting her off and saying, no, you're not entitled to this protection. Like, it's fine. Don't worry about it. And sadly, this case ends with her calling the police all night long, and him, the father, showing up at the police station and getting in a shootout with police because he started shooting the police station. And the 3 daughters are found in the back of the car with gunshot wounds to the head. Mm-hmm. And so this went all the way to the Supreme Court. Obviously, you would think Jessica was denied justice here. The mother was denied justice. She called the cops. She had the rights to have her children protected. And ultimately, the Supreme Court said, you know what, Castle Rock police didn't do anything wrong. You're not entitled to this protection. So that's one way the Equal Rights Amendment. We have a massive problem with domestic violence in the United States. And I think that story hits home to me because those girls were my neighbors. And I remember my mom sitting me down and telling me what had happened. And so that hits home. But I think we all have stories like that where we know someone not too far off that is a survivor or a victim of domestic violence. And we need to address it. And another thing is I don't know if you're familiar with the Violence Against Women Act, but a large portion of that law was struck down because we didn't have the constitutional backing of the Equal Rights Amendment. So that's one way, is violence against women. Another way that the courts fail to protect women, I'm just going to mention, there's so many more I could talk about, but I'm going to talk about 3 in particular. Pay discrimination. I'll tell you another court case. There's a woman named Betty Dukes who she worked for Walmart, and in 1995 realized, she's getting paid less, she's getting promoted less, and her and some co-plaintiffs who claim to represent 1.5 million women who work for Walmart were getting paid and promoted less. And so they had all of this evidence that they took to court about how they were getting paid less. And it seemed like a slam dunk case. But when it went to court, they said that because they couldn't bring a civil action case, and Allyson might be able to say this better, so I'll let her clarify at the end because she's a lawyer and I am not. But because they couldn't prove that Walmart was intentionally discriminating, AKA they didn't have a policy that said, here at Walmart, we pay women less and promote them less, because they couldn't prove that the discrimination was intentional, it wasn't valid. So that's another reason that we need the Equal Rights Amendment. Right. So women continue to get paid less. We can bring it to court. And the way that court cases have been going, they're like, well, you have to prove that this was intentional discrimination. And there's another really brief case I'll mention of some insurance agency paying women less. And when they asked why they got away with paying women less, it was because they said that they were paid less at their previous job. So they're basing their salary off of the previous job, and then that it's not the court's job to aside centuries of discrimination. So that's another reason. And finally, to talk about motherhood, because this is really important, we can talk about UPS. There's a woman named Peggy Young who got pregnant at UPS and her doctor said that she shouldn't be lifting above 20 pounds. And so you would think she'd be assigned some light duty work. A lot of other employees who have disabilities are entitled to light duty work. But UPS said, you can't have your current job because you can't lift above 20 pounds, but we're not going to give you light duty, even though we're giving light duty to all of these other workers, because pregnancy is not one of these clauses that we have where you have to assign someone light duty work. So they basically fire her or tell her to come back when she's not pregnant, which is 10 months later. So she lives without pay and a job for 10 months. And then she goes to the courts and again was denied justice there. And so it was pregnancy was legally discriminated against in that case. And so those are three examples of you think, well, this is just a no-brainer. Women are being discriminated against. They're getting paid less. They're not given light duty work when they're pregnant. They're not being protected from violence. You think these are just basic ways that we should be protected, but we go to court and we're not. And a lot of that is because we don't have the constitutional backing. And I'm going to let Allyson chime in there and just add anything she has to say, because like I said, she's a lawyer. I am not. These are just cases I've read about.
Yeah, but you really, I think you captured the essence of all of those important stories, Meghan, and those important issues. And I'll just kind of put a legal cap on it by saying the ERA will help in two important ways. One is it's very clear that it gives power to Congress to legislate in a way that will give effect to that guarantee against sex discrimination. So that means that important laws would not be struck down. So we've seen some laws against violence against women, part of VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, and the Stop FGM Act of 96 were both struck down by courts that said Congress, you exceeded your constitutional authority. You weren't authorized to pass a law on this issue. The ERA would ensure Congress is authorized to legislate on issues like that, on issues like maternal mortality. And then the judicial aspect is that it would raise the bar on sex discrimination so that court cases like the ones Meghan described could be reevaluated. It would provide a new avenue for arguments that survivors of domestic violence could make after suffering so many defeats in court using the current constitutional theories. This would give new hope and new opportunity. I also just want to clarify that there is still going to be a First Amendment that protects religious free exercise. And so religious freedom is still there. And within religious freedom, we see very strong respect for religious groups choosing their own ministers. So I'm not necessarily looking to the ERA to require religious groups to ordain women. I don't expect that it would have that effect because that protection of what's called a ministerial exception is so strong. Really, the law gives religious groups just absolute discretion for the most part in making those selections. But again, the ERA is geared mainly at restraining what the government can do and protecting against the government doing things that are discriminatory against women.
I think one thing I've heard or read too is kind of this idea of like, I don't know, super scrutiny versus just like regular scrutiny. I'm sure there's actual words for that, but something in the Constitution gets like an extra level of, I don't know, reverence, as opposed to just something in other laws like, say, Title IX or the 14th Amendment is not what I mean.
But like the Violence Against Women Act, the Stop FGN Act, like those things would be,
Can you speak into that too?
There may be two different concepts in there. One is that a provision that's in the text of the Constitution is going to be more primary and carry more weight as compared to a statutory provision, a law passed by Congress. And so it has more authority to begin with. On levels of scrutiny, that refers to the judicial tests that courts use when they're deciding certain cases. And so you might have heard that racial discrimination, religious discrimination, they're analyzed with something called strict scrutiny, which means there's a very high bar to prevent those types of discrimination. It has to be very well justified if the government is taking action that's race conscious. And however, when it comes to sex discrimination, it's not as high a bar. There's something called intermediate scrutiny, a different standard that's used to evaluate sex discrimination. And I know this is a bit technical, but one, I think, maybe more accessible way to put it is that it's like if you thought of race discrimination as getting a red flag from the court and being kind of more likely to be stopped, and sex discrimination maybe gets a yellow flag, is a little easier to wave through. That's the current situation.
No, that's great. I think that maybe when we consider current laws, statutory laws, as you mentioned, like Title IX and the Violence Against Women's Act and stuff, I think that's also part of the reason that so many people in the U.S. just tend to think that women do have protections under the law. Because, there's all these laws, so what's the problem?
Yeah, so there's Title IX, there's equal pay legislation, there's the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that includes discrimination based on sex. So there are statutory protections. It's just that those can be revoked or repealed by Congress. They can expire in the case of the Violence Against Women Act, and that the Constitution affects how those statutes are interpreted. So when Meghan was talking about the pay discrimination case and the sort of unbelievable idea that it's all right under current law for employers to justify paying women less because they made less at their previous jobs. And so they can just reinstantiate a cycle of discrimination and blame it on the free market and not be responsible for paying their employees equitably. That speaks to how that law has been interpreted in a way that really favors employers. So if you have constitutional protection against sex discrimination, you just have another tool to really give those laws teeth. When we meet with senators who want to tell us all the great legislation they've passed on behalf of women, we thank them, congratulate them, and then say, we want to protect your hard work and your legacy through these laws that you've worked on. And the ERA will help ensure that they're actually interpreted in a way that gives effect to your intention, which is to better women's well-being.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And could you outline then, it seems like we've done a lot of work, right? 38 states have ratified the ERA. There's been a couple hiccups here and there, but what needs to happen for this to be official?
So there's unofficial, a government official. His title is Archivist of the United States, and he has the responsibility for publishing the ERA as the 28th Amendment, now that all of both of the constitutional requirements have been met. And so on one level, what needs to happen is he just needs to do it. And we're petitioning him to go ahead and do it. One reason that he says he hasn't is because when Donald Trump was president, the DOJ issued a legal memorandum that discouraged the archivist from moving forward because of some procedural issues over the procedure of constitutional amendment, dealing with ratification deadline, dealing with states trying to take vacation. And so those issues were raised. He got cold feet, essentially, and hasn't moved forward. But there is a petition led by the ERA Coalition with thousands of signatures now that is calling on Attorney General Merrick Garland to revoke that problematic legal memo so that the archivist can go ahead and publish. That's one level. There is also litigation that's happening over this right now. So on another level, something is going to need to be decided in the courts. It's going to need to play itself out there. 3 states who've ratified the ERA in recent years, Illinois, Nevada, and Virginia, they sued our friend, the archivist, to compel him to go ahead and publish the ERA. And so that litigation is ongoing. The 5 states that tried to take back their ratification, they joined in. So they're in the mix there. On the other side of that lawsuit, that's now in federal court and that's up on appeal. Justice Revival has been a supporter of an amicus brief in support of compelling publication of the ERA. So we're supporting that litigation. And then thirdly, there is a bill in Congress right now to officially declare that there is no ratification deadline. The House has passed this bill twice in the last 2 sessions of Congress. Most recently, it passed it last spring. And now there's a companion bill in the Senate, SJ Res 1, that would eliminate the deadline on ratification. And so that's another thing that we're doing and inviting other people to do. Tell your senator you're looking to them to eliminate this arbitrary deadline so that we can have equal rights. And if you check out our website, justicerevival.org/ERA, you'll see all kinds of information and links to these actions that really anyone can take.
Yeah, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but is a ratification deadline typical for an amendment to have?
You know, in the 20th century, Congress started attaching these. I think it was with Prohibition that it first started. So you can kind of smell a political compromise in there somewhere. But what's different about the one that the Congress in 1972 attached to the ERA is it's not part of the amendment itself. It's a preliminary statement of a deadline. And so it's in a little different situation. It means essentially when the states voted, they weren't voting on a deadline. They were just voting on the ERA. And it is Article 5 that determines how the ERA is ratified. And so this deadline is a little bit of an appendage. Congress moved it once, demonstrating they have the power to move it or revoke it again. Yeah. And we think it's really important that they do that.
And so I feel like we've already touched on this to an extent, that the Equal Rights Amendment would help more than just women, right? It would help men. It would help put people in the LGBTQ community. I'm curious, are there ways that you guys could lay out that the Equal Rights Amendment would open doors for maybe other amendments to help marginalized people groups, whether that's people of color or indigenous communities or LGBTQ plus community?
Well, that's a really great question. We are quite hopeful that the ERA, in its prohibition against sex discrimination, that it would also include LGBT Americans, as well as women, as well as men, all of us in this protection against discrimination. And so we're very hopeful about that. And given the way the court interpreted the Civil Rights Act to say that discrimination on the basis of sex includes sexual orientation or gender identity, there's there's reason to believe they could interpret the ERA similarly as well. I think the question about future amendments is an interesting one. I would actually want to learn more to speak to that intelligently, because I haven't quite put my mind to it the way I have the ERA.
And it's interesting, as one person I talked to about the ERA said something along the lines of, it should be difficult to amend the Constitution. And I get that sentiment in that we don't want to, be constantly changing our fundamental document of how our nation runs. But also at the same time, it's frustrating when there's when there's amendments that at least I would view as necessary and beneficial to all, for those to be difficult to pass.
And 150 years, that's a good long time to fight for something. As you were talking, it reminded me, I did hear some constitutional law scholars who spoke to a coalition meeting who had a theory that constitutional reform kind of comes in waves. And we haven't had kind of a season of reform in some time, if I understood them correctly. So they thought the ERA would sort of open the door to more reform, given their read of the history of these things.
Well, I hope that's the case, because let's, as we talked about earlier, we really want to see America become all that she can be. In the sense that she uplifts the widows and the orphans, the marginalized, the oppressed, and is a safe haven for people to be, truly, like the Statue of Liberty says, bring your poor huddled masses yearning to break free. I think that poem really encapsulates what I would like to see as the heart of what America is. And that includes women, and that includes the LGBTQ community, and that includes immigrants, and all forms of gender identity, and all races, and all ethnicities. And so, I hope for reform. But I wanted to add one more curiosity question that I've sort of been remembering and forgetting throughout this episode, and I remembered it and I wrote it down. So now I'm going to ask, because I've heard you mention the sort of influence of corporate interests that have prevented the ERA from passing throughout history. We like to just blame Phyllis Schlafly for all of our problems, but it wasn't all her. There's other entities at work, and I was curious if you could speak into a little bit of that corporate lobbying, perhaps, that has prevented progress through the ERA.
I know that when Schlafly was active, that was a time when insurance companies and employers feared to lose an advantage if women were entitled to equal treatment, equal rights. So you can think about employers who had the benefit of cheap, underpaid female labor, not wanting to lose that. Yeah. You can imagine, I haven't updated this research. It would be interesting to see what are the sex disparities in the insurance field. We know it took the Affordable Care Act to say, can we make maternity a regular thing for insurance coverage and not a special extra rider that families have to save up to make sure they can insure having a child. And so I'm just kind of surmising that that's an example of the type of maybe disparities that insurance companies were mindful of. And so we should actually look for a source for that. But I have heard that regularly, that it wasn't just Schlafly, that there were, like you said, corporate interests that were resistant to this. And, hey, look, today there were just 3 senators who this week sent a letter to the archivist to say, no, don't publish this. You said you wouldn't, and we're going to hold you to that. And so you've got 3 white men in power who are taking a stand against the ERA being finalized. So we know, a lot of folks are affecting what's happening, especially the more powerful. And I would be very curious to learn more about what's behind their position. So that's an invitation. Senators, would love to hear what you think about women being full equals under our Constitution.
Yeah, same for those corporations. I really want to know their beef. You know?
Yeah, I mean, so much of it comes down to just money.
Yeah,
at the
absolutely.
End of the day. Like, that's why so many companies outsource to other nations where they can
get cheap
pay
labor.
really cheap labor and not have to worry about human rights violations because they can, outsource to China or to any number of countries in Southeast Asia or Africa, and they don't have to pay as much. Like, so much of it comes down to capitalism and the bottom line, which is infuriating.
I mean, especially when you think that, women's well-being is a best investment. That is to say, gender equality is something that the World Bank promotes globally because it has such beneficial effects because of the way women use resources, not just to benefit themselves, but their family. And so there's some real evidence that shows the rights of women benefit the entire community. And maybe those are some facts we need to keep lifting up.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
And I think that's true in general. I think, and this has been my philosophy for a long time, is that if perhaps in a position of privilege, if sacrificing some of those privileges for the sake of my children being able to grow up in a society that is more whole, that is more equitable across race and gender, that's a sacrifice I'm willing to make, because I believe that what's better for us ultimately is not necessarily the amount of money I can make or how I can profit off of others, but actually sort of the all of humanity being recognized and dignified in one place. Which kind of leads into the next thing is, like, we want this. We want good things for our future, for our children's future, for our children's children's future. And we want to see America grow and become, again, all she can be. So what can the people do in supporting the ERA amendment being passed and officialized in our Constitution? And what are practical steps that we can actually take?
Yeah. So I'll give 3 calls to action. One, if you are a faith leader or a faith leader, we have an interfaith statement of support for the ERA. It's got over 500 faith leader signatures already. We would love to have many thousands more. This again is at justicerevival.org/ERA. Spread the word, help us grow the number of signatures and show there's a lot of faith support for equal rights. Second, at that same URL, you'll find a link to contact your member of Congress, say specifically your U.S. senators. And the only Republicans that are supporting SJ Res 1 to eliminate the ratification deadline, the only Republicans in support so far are Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski.
Women.
Shocker.
Takes a few good women. And so especially if your senator is a Republican who is not either Collins or Murkowski, really need you to reach out to them and say, hey, this is a bipartisan cause. In the states, we've seen bipartisan support. We've seen a diverse array of support for ERA ratification. Tell your senator, you're looking to them to support equality. And then the third call to action is at eracoalition.org. That's a petition to Merrick Garland to say, withdraw that Trump-era legal memo. Let the archivist go ahead and publish this. So those are 3, hopefully even easy things that folks can do digitally to show your support. And Meghan might have other ideas of kind of spreading the word, which I know she's been doing a lot through media.
Yeah, I would just say talk about it as much as you can. It sounds like you guys have been doing that. I think there's, like I said, a real lack of knowledge that the Equal Rights Amendment is even a thing. And so I say talk to all of your friends and family about it. Tell them how important it is. And of course, contact your members of Congress. There's actually a really easy way to do that. Calling is always best. So I'm going to say that. That's the most important thing, is to actually call them. It's the best way. But there's also an easy way on Justice Revival's website to send an email to your members of Congress. And Justice Revival also has a ton of other resources that would be really helpful if you want to learn more about the ERA.
Amazing. Yeah, I mean, what a, not time-consuming way to contribute to such an important issue. Like, everyone can send an email, everyone can make a phone call.
Yeah.
It
Take
takes
20
no time.
minutes out of your day.
If even.
Yeah.
You know? Or,
if you did all the tasks,
switch
20 minutes maybe.
Make multiple emails, switch to all the different emails, send the same
Just
letter.
spam them with
Spam them.
emails.
And it should all just, in the, the email title, just be like ERA urgent.
Well,
Urgent right now.
Megan, I think earlier, forgive me if you guys mentioned this and I just zoned out and missed it, but you mentioned there's a letter or a petition we can send to religious leaders in the community to have them sign as well to support.
Yeah, there's this interfaith statement for the ERA that over 500 faith leaders have already signed, and you can link to this through Justice Revival's website as well. It's a petition on Action Network, and so please encourage faith leaders to take a look, sign on. We need thousands of signatures. We know that there is vocal religious opposition still, and this will help demonstrate that there is resounding religious support.
I also feel like it's our duty. So we know that the conservative religious right has held back rights, specifically white Christian women, right, that have held back the ERA for being passed. And so for me, as a white Christian woman, I feel like it's an act of repentance and duty to make sure that the Equal Rights Amendment is passed today.
Yeah, I think that's part of what makes something like this so powerful is the conviction of repentance, and like I'm going to do my part actually to correct a wrong that has affected many, many women, many men, many people of color, many of those that identify as LGBTQ. I mean, it's so important, I think, to approach something like this with that conviction and that fire that you bring. And I just feel really grateful that you're willing to share that with us. Because I definitely feel a fire under my ass to, get some shit done and contribute to this issue.
And I think ultimately inequality is such a poison. And it's a poison not just to the people who are disaffected, although it does affect them much worse, but it's actually a poison to the people who obtain privilege from it. Because we're not better off as a society when there's unequal power dynamics and when some people can gain and take advantage and other people are taken advantage of. And so, yeah, this is like a human rights thing. This is a religious thing. This is, I believe, the type of thing Jesus would have been going after if he were here today. And it really comes down to I believe that what's best for men, what's best for the conservative right, the religious right, and other opposition groups it is for everyone's benefit that we promote equality in our Constitution across the board.
Absolutely.
Amen to that.
I feel like we've been to church,
This is the church I've been missing.
Yeah, this is it. This is the kind of church I'd like to see.
Beautiful.
Wow. So ladies, thank you so much. This has just been an incredible time to hear from both of you and really get super clear about what the issues are and how we can do better collectively and how we can push forward for progress. But Megan, you've answered this question before. Allyson, this is your first time. But I would love to know, what does woman being mean to both of you?
Yeah, I honestly don't remember what I said last time.
Perfect.
Yeah, so for me, I think being a woman being is like, I'm a human. I'm deserving of basic human rights. We're talking about the Equal Rights Amendment here. I'm a person. I am not less than. I'm not a second-class citizen. I'm fully human and should be treated as such. And so for me, particularly in light of this conversation, woman being means treat me as a human being made in the image of God, deserving of rights and resources as any man. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, Megan, that's so funny because I've been listening to your answer to this a lot lately because we're working on like a trailer for Woman Being that shows
Coming
a lot of
soon.
people's answers to that question. And you said almost the exact same thing. So you're, which is incredible.
You're
like,
consistent.
Yeah, you are. I think you also say in your statement last time was like, I'm a human, not a stumbling block, not an object, or something like that. I like have it playing memorized in my
powerful.
head because I've listened to it a bunch in this trailer that we're making. So that's amazing. And that is, a beautiful sentiment. We are humans. Like, it's not even a sentiment, it's a fact. We are humans worthy of being treated as humans. So thank you for that.
And mine resonates. I think we're on a common theme here, but I just wanted to say the divine spark lives in each of us, in every woman, just as in every man, every person, and that's the essence of our being.
Wow,
So good.
that's so good. Again, taking us to church.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you guys have kind of named off a lot of resources throughout the episode, but any other that you would like to add for people that are really trying to get involved or become more educated outside of what we've talked about today, specifically around the ERA? What would you recommend? Go ahead and fire them off.
I'm turning to look at my bookshelf. We said Jesus and John Wayne, and that's a really important one. There's a book by Jimmy Carter called A Call to Action. So we haven't mentioned him, but Jimmy Carter, good Baptist Sunday school teacher, faithful Christian that he is pro ERA. He signed the bill Congress passed to extend the deadline. And in his book, A Call to Action, he includes that as an important kind of action step after talking about how gender hierarchy in the church leads to such harms for women worldwide. So I'd throw that out there too as a great resource for Christians in particular.
Yeah. And of course, there's all of this information. A lot of this information is on the Justice Revival website. So if you go to justicerevival.org/ERA, there's the place where you can sign the interfaith statement of support. You can tell your senators to support the Equal Rights Amendment. You can read the policy brief, which I highly, highly recommend. You're going to open it when you look at the policy brief and be like, oh, this is a lot of information. But a lot of it is also sourced. So it has works cited. And so it looks longer than it is. And I'm telling you to read the whole thing because it's really important. So obviously Justice Revival has all of these websites, all of these resources. I would recommend, if you're looking specifically at court cases, and it's shocking and so frustrating, you can read Equal Means Equal by Jessica Neuwirth, which is a little bit challenging to read because it is quite a bit of legalese, but it really does break down the cases and how an Equal Rights Amendment would make a difference. And there, so those are a few, but I would really encourage starting by checking out the Equal Rights Amendment or the Justice Revival's website, /ERA.
Wow. Well, I'm going to have to check out all of those. Literally, we'll buy them as soon as we get off this call.
The books.
And ladies, I just want to say thank you so much for giving us your time today. So generously sharing all of your beautiful thoughts, your knowledge.
I'm so thankful that we have an expert and an expert in passion about the Equal Rights Amendment, like that we get to pick you guys' brains. It's such a privilege.
Yeah, it really, really is. And honestly, I love that we got to do this. So with all that being said, we're just going to like wrap up, and woman beings, make sure you're checking out Meghan and Allyson on Instagram. Make sure you're checking out Justice Revival. And while you're at it, go ahead and follow us. We're always have a conversation going on Instagram. And we always want to know what you want to hear and what you want to see from us. Come sit at the digital table, if you will.
And check out our episode with Meghan. Season
our
1.
Other episode with Meghan. We talked a lot about her book that was coming out then. It is now out. I've read the book. It's wonderful. Women Rising by Meghan Tschanz. You guys should also check out that book. It's a great resource on sort of Christianity and feminism colliding. It goes a lot into her personal story, sort of breaking down the roles of women in the church and how she came to the conclusion she came to. And it's just a beautiful insight into that process. So.
Yeah. And check out Faith and Feminism, the podcast as well.
Yes.
One of our biggest inspirations in starting this podcast was your podcast, Meghan. And so, for anyone that wants to, like Kelly said, experience the OG podcast, that is the one you should check into. And she's got tons of great content coming out regularly that I really appreciate and value highly.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's all love here at Woman Being today. And thanks so much for being here with us. And we will catch you next time.
Bye.
Thanks so much. Bye.